Judy Buenoano. For the better part of 2 decades, the people closest to Judy Buenoano had a habit of dying. It happened to her first husband, then to a boyfriend, then to her own son, and very nearly to the fiancé who came after. And every single time, a doctor signed something ordinary on a piece of paper, until investigators finally started digging up the bodies and discovered that the one thing all those deaths had in common was sitting quietly in the victim's veins. Judith Welty was born in Texas in 1943, and by the time she reached Florida, she had reinvented herself completely. She even took a new surname, Buenoano, a loose Spanish play on the name Goodyear. That name belonged to her first husband. James Goodyear was a sergeant in the United States Air Force, a steady military man who married Judy and built a quiet life with her in Orlando. He was the kind of husband who carried life insurance and named his wife the beneficiary. In September of 1971, he came home from a tour overseas and, within weeks, fell violently ill. He died on September 16, 1971, and the cause was written off as natural. It was anything but natural. Years later, when his body was exhumed, the cause of death was effectively beyond dispute. Acute arsenic poisoning. One federal investigator who stood there when Goodyear's crypt was opened never forgot the moment. He described a visible cloud rising out of the vault and the strangest odor he had ever encountered in his life. The body eerily preserved by the very poison that had killed it. He would later say Judy Buenoano was the coldest person he had ever met. After Goodyear died, Judy collected $33,000 in life insurance and another $62,000 in compensation from the Veterans Administration. Put plainly, her husband's death came with a payout, and she cashed it. That became the pattern that ran through the rest of her life. A boyfriend named Bobby Joe Morris died in 1978, and when his body was later exhumed in Colorado, it told the exact same story. Arsenic again. His death brought in roughly $23,000 more. Then there was her own son, Michael. He had joined the Army, but his health collapsed under a creeping paralysis that doctors could not explain. The condition grew so severe that he ended up fitted with heavy metal braces just to keep himself upright. On May 13, 1980, Judy took him out on the East River near Pensacola in a canoe. It capsized. Weighed down by the braces locked onto his legs, the 19-year-old drowned. Investigators would later conclude that the paralysis which put him in those braces was arsenic, and that the moment the canoe tipped was no accident at all. Michael's death paid out around $20,000 in military life insurance. By the time she got engaged to a man named John Gentry, Judy had quietly buried a string of people and collected something close to $240,000 in the process. Gentry was lined up to be next. She had begun feeding him capsules she told him were vitamins. They were laced with arsenic. And in 1983, his car exploded with him still inside it. Gentry survived the bombing. That single failure is what finally pulled the whole structure down. Once investigators started examining the attempt on his life, the questions multiplied. Why had Gentry been quietly poisoned for months before the explosion? Why were there so many insurance policies? Why did so many of the people in this woman's past die young and leave money behind? The answers led them straight back to the graves, and the graves gave up the arsenic. This is the thread that ran through every one of her cases, and it is the thread investigators would learn to pull. Almost every death around Judy had been signed off the first time as something forgettable. A husband gone from natural causes, a son lost in a drowning accident, a boyfriend quietly laid to rest. None of it raised a single eyebrow at the time. It was only the exhumation, the slow, grim work of reopening graves and running toxicology on what was left, that turned a string of unrelated tragedies into a single, deliberate murder spree. Arsenic does not vanish. It settles into the body and stays there, and years later, in case after case, it was still waiting to be found. Arrested that same year, Judy was convicted in 1984 of murdering her son and of the attempted murder of Gentry. A year later, a separate jury convicted her of killing James Goodyear, and this time, the sentence was death. She was also convicted of grand theft and arson tied to the insurance schemes that had bankrolled her life for more than a decade. On March 30th, 1998, Judy Buenoano was put to death in Florida's electric chair. She was the first woman the state had executed since 1848, and only the third woman executed anywhere in the country since the 1970s. Asked if she had any final words, she answered, weakly, that she did not. She maintained her innocence right up to the end. Judy Buenoano was patient. She used poison, and she used time, and she let the doctors do the rest. But not every black widow had the stomach for something that slow. Some of them simply waited for the right moment and reached for a gun. Betty Lou Beets. When Jimmy Don Beets disappeared off his fishing boat in the summer of 1983, half of his Texas community spent days searching the lake for his body. They dragged the water. They walked the shoreline. It never once occurred to anyone to search his own front yard, because the fire captain everyone was mourning had never made it out onto that lake at all. 3 years earlier, Betty Lou Beets had looked like nothing more than a woman with a complicated love life. She had been married 5 times. She had been deaf since a childhood bout of measles, and buried inside that complicated history was a detail that nobody bothered to connect at the time. She had once shot a previous husband, a man named Bill Lane, and walked away from it without ever truly answering for what she had done. Looking back, that was not a one-time loss of temper. It was a preview. Jimmy Don Beets was a captain with the Dallas Fire Department, a respected man with a steady pension and a stack of benefits attached to his name. He was Betty Lou's 5th husband. To everyone who knew them, he had simply vanished into the dark water one August night. The truth was lying a few feet from where they slept. On August 6, 1983, Jimmy Don was shot with a .38 caliber pistol. Betty Lou buried him in the yard of their home in Gun Barrel City, and then she built a decorative wishing well directly on top of the grave. After that, she staged the disappearance. His boat was found drifting empty on the lake, his fishing license, his heart medication, and his life jacket all left behind to sell the story of a man lost on the water. Search teams combed the lake for days. Friends grieved. The whole community accepted that a beloved fire captain had drowned, and Betty Lou played the role of the heartbroken widow flawlessly while he lay cooling in her own front yard. A wishing well. She decorated the spot where her husband was buried with an ornamental wishing well, and then she stood there grieving in front of investigators. And no, I am not making that up. What investigators did not know yet was that Jimmy Don was not the only husband in the ground. Doyle Wayne Barker, Betty Lou's 4th husband, had also been shot, also with a .38 caliber pistol, and buried under a storage shed in the back. 2 husbands, 2 graves, on the same small piece of property, with the woman who killed them both living right on top of them. The case broke in 1985, and it broke from inside her own family. Her son, Robert, came forward and told authorities exactly where to dig. He admitted that he had helped bury Jimmy Don. Her daughter testified about the role she had been pulled into with Barker's burial. When investigators arrived with shovels, they uncovered both men on the same day. Prosecutors built the entire case around a single cold word: remuneration. Betty Lou had not killed out of rage or passion. She had killed for the payout. The scheme, they argued, was to collect more than $100,000 in insurance benefits, along with a firefighter's pension worth roughly $1,200 every single month. Months before Jimmy Don died, she had even forged his signature on a $10,000 life insurance policy from J.C. Penney. A relative happened to catch the forgery and had the policy canceled. It should have been a flashing warning to everyone around her. Nobody acted on it. Her trial began on July 11, 1985, in Henderson County. Betty Lou pleaded not guilty and tried to push the blame onto her own children, the same children who had buried the bodies and then handed her to the police. The jury did not believe her. On October 11, 1985, she was convicted, and 3 days later she was sentenced to death. A defense built around years of abuse she had suffered in her marriages was raised, but only later, on appeal, far too late to move the verdict. Her own trial attorney was later found to have had a conflict of interest, with rights to her story quietly signed over to his son. Betty Lou Beets spent nearly 15 years on death row while her appeals wound through the courts. The governor of Texas at the time, George Bush, reviewed the case and stated publicly that after weighing the evidence, he agreed with the jury that she was guilty of murder. On February 24, 2000, she was executed by lethal injection in Huntsville. She was 62 years old. She declined a final meal, and she chose to say nothing at all. She was the fourth woman executed in the United States since the 1970s, and to the end she insisted she could not remember the night her husband died, that the whole thing was simply a blank to her. Betty Lou Beets needed a gun, a shovel, and a backyard nobody thought to check. 1,000 miles north in upstate New York, another woman was about to prove that you did not need any of that. All she needed was a bottle of antifreeze and a story that people desperately wanted to believe. Stacy Castor. David Castor's death looked like a suicide. 2 years later, his daughter's apparent suicide note looked like a written confession to 2 separate murders. So how did both of those documents end up being the work of the same hand? The woman at the center of it had already buried 2 husbands, and she was fully prepared to bury her own daughter's freedom to keep the secret intact. If you had asked anyone around Clay, New York, about Stacy Castor, they would have described a wife twice widowed by terrible luck. Her first husband had dropped dead far too young. Her second had apparently taken his own life. People felt sorry for her. They had no idea what they were actually looking at. David Castor was a heating and cooling contractor, Stacy's second husband, a hands-on man who had built a small business from nothing. In August of 2005, he was found dead inside their home. Beside his body sat a glass of green liquid and a container of antifreeze, arranged to look like a man who had decided to end his own life. The scene did not hold up under any real scrutiny. Antifreeze, ethylene glycol, is sweet to the taste, and it kills slowly and agonizingly, and almost no one on earth chooses it as a way to die by their own hand. Worse for Stacy, David's fingerprints were nowhere on the glass that supposedly held his final drink. What investigators did find was a turkey baster sitting in the kitchen trash. It carried 2 things at once: traces of ethylene glycol and David's own DNA. The picture was no longer a suicide. It was a man who had been force-fed poison. That discovery sent investigators straight back to her first husband. Michael Wallace had died years earlier at just 38, written off at the time as a heart attack. In 2007, his body was exhumed and retested, and the new cause of death came back as a homicide, killed by the very same poison. two husbands, the same antifreeze, the same grieving widow standing over both of them. And somehow, it gets worse. As the suspicion closed in around her, Stacy did not run. She built herself an exit. In September of 2007, she turned on her own daughter, 20-year-old Ashley. Over a span of roughly 17 hours, she fed her crushed prescription pills hidden inside vodka, orange juice, and soda, and then she laid a typed suicide note down beside her. The note confessed, written in Ashley's voice, to the murders of both David and Michael. Ashley was meant to die and to carry the blame for everything her mother had done. Ashley survived. And the note her mother had typed to frame her became the exact thing that destroyed Stacy instead. It was riddled with one very specific misspelling of the word antifreeze, written precisely the way Stacy herself pronounced it out loud during questioning. It carried Stacy's fingerprints, not Ashley's. It had been typed on the family computer while Ashley was sitting in school across town, and investigators had wiretap recordings that captured the sound of someone tapping it out on the keys. Every detail that was supposed to make Ashley look guilty pointed in one direction, and it was not toward the daughter. There was a cold logic to all of it that prosecutors laid out piece by piece. The forged will had quietly handed Stacy control of David's estate. The staged suicide had closed the book on his death, and the daughter, drugged and set up with a typed confession, was meant to close the book on everything else, taking two murders to the grave with her so the investigation would simply stop. It was a plan to wipe out the only witness who might ever connect the deaths, and it came within hours of working. The trial opened in January of 2009. On February 5th, a jury convicted Stacy Castor of murdering David, of the attempted murder of her own daughter Ashley, and of forging David's will. At sentencing, the judge told her that in more than 3 decades inside the justice system, surrounded by killers of every variety, he had never once seen anyone quite like her. He called what she had done a form of premeditated torture. He told her she stood in a class entirely by herself. Ashley faced the court and said that she hated her mother for ruining so many lives. Stacy was sentenced to 51 1/3 years to life. She never got out. On June 11th, 2016, Stacy Castor died in prison of a heart attack. She was 48 years old. By the end, the woman who had spent years dressing murder up as misfortune was remembered for the one thing she had tried hardest to avoid, which was being seen clearly. 2 husbands poisoned with the same sweet, lethal liquid, both deaths staged to look like anything but what they were, and a daughter who had to testify against the mother who tried to end her life. Stacy Castor tried to disappear behind a single forged note typed in someone else's voice. The next woman would go a great deal further than one forged page. She forged an entire second person, gave that invented woman a name, a history, and a death of her own, and then she calmly stepped into the role herself. Audrey Marie Hilley. In 1975, Audrey Marie Hilley buried her husband and accepted the sympathy of her entire Alabama town. A few years later, she would fake her own death, invent a twin sister who never existed, and marry the same man twice under 2 completely different names. It sounds impossible. It very nearly worked. And what finally unraveled all of it began with her own daughter, lying in a hospital bed, being slowly poisoned by the one person she trusted most in the world. Anniston, Alabama, May of 1975. Frank Hilley, 45 years old, fell ill and died, and a doctor recorded the cause as infectious hepatitis. Frank Hilley was a working husband and father, an unremarkable man living an unremarkable life with his wife and children. He was the kind of person whose death raises no alarms anywhere. His passing was mourned quietly and explained away as nothing more than illness. For 4 years, that explanation held without a single crack. A husband simply gets sick, and he dies, and the whole town accepts it and moves on with their lives. You would think someone, somewhere, would have said something. Nobody did. What reopened Frank's grave, first in the minds of investigators and then literally, was his daughter. By 1979, Carol Hilley, still a teenager, had become gravely and inexplicably ill. The doctors who finally tested her found poison in her system, and as the family pushed harder for answers, the truth turned horrifying. Carol was not sick at all. She was being deliberately poisoned, and the person responsible for it was her own mother. With Carol's case exposing exactly what Audrey Marie was capable of, investigators exhumed Frank's body late in 1979. The hepatitis story fell apart in an instant. Frank Hilley had not died of any illness. He had died from a lethal dose of arsenic. The grieving widow had been a killer the entire time, standing right there beside the casket. In January of 1980, Audrey Marie was indicted. Instead of facing trial, she jumped bond and vanished, and what she did next reads like something out of fiction. She fled to Florida and became a woman named Robbie Hannon. As Robbie, she met and married a man named John Greenleaf Homan III, and the couple moved north to New Hampshire to start a new life together. Then she decided that Robbie, too, needed to disappear. She told everyone that Robbie had fallen seriously ill and traveled to Texas, where she died and donated her body to a medical institute. There was no institute. There was no death. She even planted a fake obituary in a New Hampshire newspaper to make the story stick. Then she resurfaced as a woman named Terry Martin, claiming to be Robbie's grieving twin sister, and quietly resumed the relationship with the very same husband. She had married one man under two separate identities and faked the death of the woman she was now pretending she had never been. It came apart over the small details. Co-workers and police could not verify a single piece of Robbie's supposed death. There was no record of it anywhere in Texas, no institute that had ever existed, nothing at all. The harder anyone looked, the more the twin sisters' story dissolved into thin air. When confronted, the woman calling herself Terry Martin was arrested in Vermont, where she finally gave investigators her real name. Audrey Marie Hilley was, and always had been, the same person the whole way through. One woman, one face, three identities, and a husband who had unknowingly married her twice. Extradited back to Alabama in January of 1983, she stood trial for what she had done before she ever ran. The case rested on the science that had cracked it open. Frank's exhumed remains carried the arsenic that the hepatitis diagnosis had missed, and the medical record of what had been done to Carol filled in the rest. A jury convicted her that year of the first-degree murder of Frank and the attempted murder of Carol. She was sentenced to life in prison plus an additional 20 years, and the verdicts were upheld on appeal. The story should have ended quietly behind bars. It did not. In February of 1987, Audrey Marie was granted a 3-day furlough, and she slipped away from a motel in Anniston, leaving behind a note. She was found 4 days later, delirious, lying on a back porch out in the cold. She died on February 26, 1987, of exposure, at 54 years old. The district attorney who had first given her the Black Widow nickname remarked that it was the end of a long and strange story, and that in dying the way she did, she had taken with her every secret of what she had done during the days she spent free. Audrey Marie Hilley carried her last secrets out into the cold with her. But she was far from the only woman who learned that a marriage could be quietly turned into a payout, and that a poison stirred into a sweet drink could pass for nothing more sinister than a bad heart. In Georgia, A former emergency dispatcher was about to bury two men in the exact same way, and dare anyone watching to notice the pattern forming right in front of them. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Lynn Turner. Two healthy men, years apart, both collapsed and died of what doctors called nothing more than a bad heart. One of them was a police officer. The other was a firefighter. The only thing that linked them was the woman who had loved them both, and the strange green poison that finally turned up in their bodies once somebody thought to look. How does a former emergency dispatcher, a woman whose entire job was answering other people's calls for help, end up burying two of the men closest to her using the very same method? It started in Georgia in the 1990s with a marriage that looked completely ordinary from the outside. Maurice Glenn Turner was a Cobb County police officer, the kind of steady, physically fit young man who was supposed to have decades ahead of him. He married Julia Lynn Turner, and for a while they were just another couple. Then, on March 3, 1995, Glenn went to bed feeling unwell and never woke up. He was only in his 30s, and the cause of death was listed as an irregular heartbeat. Nobody questioned it. A young man's heart had simply failed, and Lynn collected on his life insurance and his police pension more than $150,000 in benefits and interest by the time it was all paid out. Within months, she had moved on. She was already involved with a Forsyth County firefighter named Randy Thompson, a man who would father her two children and become, in everything but paperwork, her second husband. On January 22, 2001, Randy Thompson collapsed and died. He was 32 years old, and the cause listed on his paperwork was, almost word for word, the same thing that had killed Glenn Turner 6 years earlier: an irregular heartbeat. The same finding on two death certificates, 6 years apart. That's not a typo, by the way. Lynn collected once again, this time around $36,000, after a larger policy on Thompson had quietly lapsed without her knowing. Another tragic young death, another grieving partner. And that might have been the end of it. But two families were paying attention. Glenn Turner's mother and Randy Thompson's relatives compared notes, and what they saw chilled them. The same woman, the same kind of sudden death in two healthy men, the same convenient insurance money landing in the same hands. They pushed investigators to take a second look, and that second look changed everything. When toxicologists examined Randy Thompson's body, they found ethylene glycol, antifreeze, the sweet, brightly colored liquid that sits in nearly every garage in the country. It leaves behind a signature, tiny crystals that form in the kidneys as the body breaks it down, and those crystals were there. Investigators exhumed Glenn Turner, ran the same tests, and found exactly the same thing. Both men had been poisoned with antifreeze, slipped, prosecutors believed, into food and sweet drinks where its taste would vanish. At one point, Lynn had even asked a worker at an animal shelter about the substances used to put animals down. The case against Lynn Turner was unusual because it had to be tried twice in two different counties, since each man had died in a different jurisdiction. In May of 2004, a jury in Houston County convicted her of murdering Glenn Turner, and she was sentenced to life in prison. Nearly 3 years later, in March of 2007, a second jury in a different county convicted her of murdering Randy Thompson and handed her a second life sentence with no chance of parole. The district attorney who tried the first case was asked whether he had ever encountered a death by antifreeze before, and he answered plainly that he had not seen one in this state. Her own defense attorney admitted the obvious problem after the second conviction, that once a jury knows you have already been convicted of poisoning one partner, it becomes nearly impossible to convince them you had nothing to do with the second. There was a bitter irony hanging over all of it. The woman who had spent her workdays answering emergency calls had quietly engineered two emergencies of her own and nearly walked away from both. Lynn Turner was never executed. She spent the rest of her life behind bars, and on August 30th, 2010, she was found dead in her cell at the age of 42. She had taken a fatal overdose of blood pressure medication, and investigators found no sign of foul play. The woman who had used a quiet, invisible poison on two men ended her own story with one. Lynn Turner hid her poison inside the people she claimed to love and trusted that no one would ever test for it. The next woman would take that same instinct and aim it at total strangers, lacing products on store shelves and gambling that a wave of random, terrifying deaths would bury the one death she actually wanted. Stella Nickell. In the summer of 1986, people in the Seattle area started dying after taking ordinary headache capsules straight off the store shelf. It looked like the work of some faceless madman poisoning products at random, the kind of thing that empties pharmacy aisles overnight. But the truth was far colder and far more personal. One of those victims was never a random target at all. She was a wife, and her husband's death was the entire point. Stella Nickell had a problem that plenty of people have. She wanted a different life than the one her marriage was giving her. The difference was what she was willing to do about it. Bruce Nickell was a 52-year-old heavy equipment operator, a hard-working man married to Stella in Washington State. On June 5, 1986, he took a few Excedrin capsules for a headache and collapsed. He was pronounced dead, and doctors attributed it to emphysema, the natural consequence of a lifetime of smoking. No one suspected a thing. 6 days later, and a few towns away, a 40-year-old bank manager named Sue Snow took 2 Excedrin capsules before work and collapsed in her bathroom. She had no connection to the Nickells whatsoever. But this time, an assistant medical examiner leaned in close during the autopsy and caught a faint smell, the telltale bitter almond odor of cyanide. Toxicology confirmed it. Sue Snow had been killed by cyanide hidden inside an over-the-counter painkiller. That discovery set off a public panic, and it also sent investigators back to the only other recent death tied to the same product. They re-examined Bruce Nickell. The emphysema finding had been wrong. Bruce had died of cyanide too. Now there were 2 victims and a terrifying possibility that someone was randomly lacing Excedrin bottles across the region and slipping them back onto shelves. Investigators pulled contaminated bottles from stores. 5 poisoned bottles turned up in the Seattle area. And that is where the math stopped making sense. Of those 5 tainted bottles, 2 had been turned in by the very same person, Stella Nickell. She claimed she had bought them at different stores at different times. An astonishing coincidence that no one could quite swallow. And somehow, it gets worse. Because the cyanide was not the only thing inside those capsules. When the FBI crime lab examined the poisoned pills under magnification, they found tiny green flecks mixed in with the white powder. The flecks were a chemical used to kill algae in home fish tanks, sold under the name Algae Destroyer. Investigators learned that Stella kept fish and that she had bought that exact product. The theory came together fast. She had crushed the algaecide tablets in a container, then used the same uncleaned container to grind up the cyanide, contaminating her own murder weapon with a substance that pointed straight back to her. Then her own daughter came forward. Cynthia Hamilton told the FBI that her mother had researched poisons, had talked openly about killing Bruce, had wanted out of the marriage and into the insurance money. Investigators found Stella's fingerprints on library books about poisons, including a copy of a book called Human Poisoning that she had checked out and never returned. The motive was exactly what the daughter described. Stella had taken out roughly $76,000 in insurance on Bruce, with an additional $100,000 payable if his death was ruled accidental. That extra $100,000 is the key to the entire horrifying plan. A quiet, natural death from emphysema was worth far less to her than an accidental death caused by random product tampering. So she did not just poison her husband. She poisoned strangers too, to make his murder look like an accident and to nearly double her payout. 2 innocent people died so that one death could be disguised. In 1988, Stella Nickell went on trial, and she made history in the worst possible way. She became the first person ever convicted under the Federal Anti-Tampering Act, the law written after earlier poisoning scares to punish exactly this kind of crime. The prosecutor told the jury this was a woman who wanted more from life than her marriage could give her, and whose greed set in motion a scheme that was always going to cost at least 2 people their lives. The judge called the crimes acts of exceptional callousness and cruelty. Stella was sentenced to 90 years in prison. She has maintained her innocence ever since. Her daughter, the one who turned her in, collected a large share of the reward that had been offered in the case. As things stand, Stella Nickell will not be eligible for release until she is nearly 100 years old. Stella Nickell killed strangers to camouflage a single murder for money. On the other side of the country, in California, another wife wanted her husband gone and his benefits in her hands. She would not bother with poison or disguise. She would simply hire it done for the price of $100. Susan Russo. David Russo was told, half as a grim joke, that he was worth more dead than alive. The military benefits attached to his name added up to nearly $1 million. His wife heard exactly the same thing he did. And not long after, while their 2 daughters slept down the hall, somebody put a bullet in the back of his head for a fee of $100. This story does not begin with a poison or a patient, drawn-out scheme. It begins with a number, and with what that number did to a marriage. Riverdale, California, in the early 1990s. David Russo was a chief petty officer in the Navy, stationed at Lemoore Naval Air Station, and a volunteer firefighter on top of it. He was 43 years old. He was the kind of man whose life was heavily insured by the military he served. Told that his death and survivor benefits could approach $1 million, he reportedly remarked that he was probably worth more dead than alive. He had no idea how literally his own wife would take that. In the early hours of July 14th, 1994, David was shot once in the back of the head inside his own home, while the couple's 2 young daughters slept elsewhere in the house. The weapon was his own 9mm Beretta, wrapped in a towel to muffle the sound. His body was loaded into his white Dodge Intrepid and driven out toward the Kings River, where the killers tried, and failed, to burn the car to destroy the evidence. It did not take long for the picture to come into focus, because the plan had been almost careless in its simplicity. Susan Russo had arranged the whole thing with her boyfriend, a man named Jason Andrews, and a second accomplice. The price they were paid to kill her husband was $100. $100, set against benefits worth close to $1 million, including a lump sum of more than $200,000 and monthly survivor payments that would have continued for the rest of her life. Investigators kept circling back to that money, because it was the only thing about the killing that made any sense. There was no robbery, nothing taken, no sign of a stranger. What there was a wife who stood to become wealthy the moment her husband stopped breathing. $100 to turn herself into a millionaire. And no, I am not making that up. What turned this case from a brutal murder into something almost unbelievable was what Susan did after she was arrested. Sitting in custody, she went to work cleaning up the loose ends. She approached a fellow inmate and tried to arrange for her own accomplice to be killed in his cell, so that he could never testify against her. She approached another inmate and tried to get her to lie on the witness stand, to falsely claim she had been David's lover, all to prop up a story that Susan had been an abused and desperate wife. Both women went straight to the detectives instead and gave recorded statements. Susan had tried to murder her way out of a murder charge, and in doing so, she handed prosecutors a fresh stack of evidence against herself. In 1996, a Fresno County jury convicted Susan Russo of first-degree murder, of conspiracy, and of soliciting the killing of her own accomplice to silence him. The jury also found special circumstances, that the murder had been carried out lying in wait, and that it had been done for financial gain. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The story took one more strange turn many years later. In 2017, the governor of California commuted her sentence, pointing to claims of past abuse and to her conduct in prison. A parole board found her suitable for release in early 2018, but after a wave of public outrage, including from her own daughter, who said her mother had never once apologized or taken responsibility, and who asked why the woman who killed her father deserved a second chance when he never got one, that parole was reversed. Susan Russo stayed behind bars. She died there of natural causes on September 29, 2022, at 67 years old. Susan Russo paid $100 and used a borrowed pair of hands to do her killing. The last woman in this story spent more than 20 years doing the same thing on a far larger scale, working through a string of husbands and lovers, collecting on every one of them, and walking free again and again because the people who could have stopped her were too frightened to speak. Josephine Gray. Over the span of more than 20 years, 3 men close to Josephine Gray were shot to death. 2 of them husbands, and 1 the boyfriend who came between them. Each time, the police had a suspect, and each time, the case fell apart, because the witnesses who could have put her away were too terrified of her to ever take the stand. For decades, almost nobody outside of Montgomery County, Maryland, had heard the name Josephine Gray. She worked for a time as a school custodian. She blended in, and that ordinariness was exactly what let her keep getting away with it. Her first husband was a man named Norman Stribling. On March 3, 1974, he was found shot once in the head, slumped in his parked car on a road in Montgomery County, the scene staged to look like a robbery gone wrong. The case went nowhere. Josephine collected $16,000 in life insurance and moved on. Her second husband was William Gray, a man everyone knew as Robert. By 1990, that marriage had turned dangerous. Robert had gone to the authorities and accused Josephine and a man named Clarence Good of threatening his life, and he was scheduled to testify against them. He never got the chance. On November 9, 1990, 1 week before he was set to take the stand, Robert Gray was shot to death inside his own apartment. There was no sign of forced entry, which meant he had let his killer in. Josephine collected again, more than $54,000 from his life insurance policies. The third man was Clarence Good himself, the same accomplice Robert had named. He had been Josephine's cousin, her lover, and her partner in at least one of the killings. In June of 1996, his body was found shot in the head and stuffed into the trunk of his car in Baltimore. Josephine held a life insurance policy on him worth nearly $100,000, a policy set to lapse just days after his body turned up. She collected almost all of it. She later told a friend that Good had tried to blackmail her over Robert's death, so she had to get rid of him too. 3 men who had married her or loved her, 3 bullets, 3 insurance checks. Put simply, every relationship Josephine Gray entered ended with her cashing a policy. For years, Maryland could not make a murder charge stick. Every time prosecutors moved forward on the 1974 killing or the 1990 killing, their witnesses evaporated. The reason was as strange as the crimes themselves. Josephine had cultivated a reputation in her community for practicing witchcraft, for casting spells and working curses, and people genuinely believed she could reach them. Investigators reportedly found voodoo dolls made to represent her dead lovers, stuck through with needles. A wiretap allegedly caught her placing curses on the very detectives chasing her. Witnesses who might have spoken decided their safety, and maybe their souls, were not worth the risk, and they stayed silent. What finally trapped her was not the murders. It was the money. Federal prosecutors realized that while they might not be able to prove each killing to a Maryland jury, they could prove that Josephine had collected insurance payouts on people whose deaths she had caused, and collecting on a death you are responsible for is fraud. In 2002, a federal grand jury indicted her on 8 counts of mail and wire fraud. This time, the witnesses held. One of them testified that Josephine had confessed to all 3 killings. On August 16, 2002, she was convicted on all 8 counts. A prosecutor described her life as a book whose chapters were written in the blood of 3 men who had loved her. The brother of Clarence Good put it more bluntly, calling her an evil woman with a long history of witchcraft. The judge found that Josephine had committed cold, premeditated murder, and she was sentenced to 40 years in prison, along with an order to repay the money she had collected. Over 3 decades, that money had added up to roughly $165,000. 3 men's lives, reduced to a handful of insurance claims. Josephine Gray was in her 70s when, in December of 2024, her 40-year sentence was commuted as part of a broad round of federal clemency, a decision that drew sharp criticism given that she was anything but a nonviolent offender. 8 women, 8 marriages quietly turned into paydays, and a body count that only came to light because someone, somewhere, finally refused to accept a convenient explanation. Forensic science, a handful of exhumations, and a few brave witnesses are the only reasons most of these names are known at all. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.